Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started for our check-in for this week. It's 10 o'clock or close to it. If you're dropped from this session, or if I'm dropped and I can't get back successfully in 5 minutes or so, please just check for the recording and the information to be posted on your Canvas site. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be looking at key information that we've covered this week in the recorded lectures and the materials that you've read and reviewed as well. And it also gives you the opportunity to ask some live questions during this session as well. We'll be reviewing exam number 4. The exam number 4 was completed during the last unit, and there's some items I want to clarify just to make sure that that's covered. Then we'll get into the topic of this week, which will be behaviorism, which is chapter 16. I apologize. I think in the document I sent out to you guys, it's at 15, but it's chapter 16. And then I'll pause to see if there are any questions and answers that I can provide to you a little bit at the end as well as a couple of reminders and some class information as well. As always, remember the course flow for this semester, reading the chapters. There are small chapters, but they're kind of dense. Also completing the chapter quiz homeworks and responding to the video lecture questions, as well as any other discussions that we may have. Okay, now at this time, for those of you who are here, using the chat feature, please send to me that you are present so I can note that you are here and give you some extra bonus points when I start divvying those things out a little bit later. All right, please send to me that you are present. Let's check. Okay, a couple more folks, please make sure you're listening to me. I know there's more of you out there. Okay, all right, I'll keep going then. All right, so that's where we are. And let's go ahead and get started with some of the review items from the last exam that we took. Please note that this morning I did adjust the grades a little bit. So when you go back to your Canvas site, you'll see that the grades are a little bit elevated for you for this particular exam. Okay, so let's look at some of these select items. All right, a couple of things I wanted to make sure that we understood. Learning per John Dewey is a social process, and he was not very fond of traditional education, which is the style of just the teacher-centered lecturing to everybody. He saw that the process for learning could be much more vibrant. Also, there was a couple of items on structuralism. I wanted to make sure that we understood for structuralism, the idea was to focus on elements and to examine the components of consciousness, these elements. He was interested in the idea of the sensations, not the perception. So these associations between the stimuli, these elements, is what give meanings to the sensations. Then let's jump over to William James. He was talked a couple of times in this last exam. William James had a variety of views. One of them was pragmatism. He had these pragmatic views, and he saw theories as a tool that allowed us to test out ideas as well as theories to see if they had any value to them. And that's what he refers to as the cash value of theories. The idea too with regard to pragmatism was that, and we saw this idea a couple of times before as well, is that for him, truth was not really something that was objective. We've saw previously with Kierkegaard that truth is subjective, is one's own personal experience. It's not something that can be taught, it must be experienced. So following up on that idea here, pragmatism states that ideas and theories should be judged by their cash value. What are they able to do for us? What are they able to accomplish for us? And again, we see the underpinning here of something that is very significant to the notion of functionalism, which again, pragmatism did lead and support and was a cornerstone of the idea of functionalism. Now, looking at Titchener, he did some work. Remember, he was a student of Wilhelm Wundt, and he was looking at trying to develop his ideas of structuralism. He developed this idea of what he referred to as stimulus error. And stimulus error occurs when the observer, the subject here, reports the perception and not the sensation or the conscious element, the thing that he was most interested in. He believed that by looking at conscious elements, he would be able to figure out what the structure of the mind looks like. So a stimulus era is when, in the example that we gave in the lecture, is when they're looking for the conscious elements of an apple, like sweet, cold, firm, but you said apple, and that would be the perception of the apple, not the elements of the sensation. Now, we also covered in this particular chapter, on this particular exam unit as well, is Gestalt. And we always think of Gestalt as focusing on perception. And we wanted to make sure that you understood that Gestalt was more than that. It also had ideas focusing on learning or aspects of learning. And normally that's going to be associated with Kohler, who was one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, who also was very much interested in the learning aspects and how Gestalt had an impact on that as well. Now, looking at the start of psychology in the Americas or the United States, we broke it down into 4 particular stages of development. One of them was intellectual philosophy in the US, and it was greatly influenced by the Scottish philosophers like Thomas Reid. And the Scottish philosophers, their claim to fame, so to speak, was common sense. They wanted theories and things to have common sense associated with them. The basic idea there being is, if you came up with a theory, if a theory flew in the face of common sense, they would think of it as being somewhat useless. So you can imagine what some of the Scottish philosophers would have thought of Berkeley's ideas that nothing really exists. It's all mental, all sensation, and nothing that's really real in the world, no real objects. So from their perspective, the importance of the Scottish philosophers and their common sense is this. Remember, in this time, we're developing a new perspective of psychology, of functionalism, which is going to be founded a great deal on pragmatism, things that have practicality to them, very much different than structuralism. Okay, following that idea up, a theory was proposed, and it has proven good at explaining and predicting key phenomena. This is the work of John Dewey. Is a pragmatic philosophy of John Dewey, which supposes that thought is an instrument for solving practical problems. So what we're seeing here, all these things are coming together, and what they keep saying time and time again is pragmatism, practicality, doing something, having some sort of function to them. And of course, this all leads ultimately to the idea of functionalism, which also would give spawning out to other ideas like behaviorism, IO psychology, and all those such things. Very practical aspects of psychology, very much different from structuralism, which never claimed to have any practical application whatsoever. A couple other ideas here we saw with Wertheimer, one of the other founders of Gestalt psychology. He focused that the essence of Gestalt approach was that the wholes are those things that determine the nature of their parts rather than the other way around. Remember, the whole point of Gestalt approach to psychology was that they saw how we deal with things in their wholes, in their entirety. Okay, and we can't be reductionist as some of the other psychologists during that era stated, meaning we can't break things down into their elements, because the Gestaltists say we don't work that way. We see wholes, and that's what we do. So getting back to this idea of functionalism, functionalism was influenced indirectly by the ideas and work of William James. Okay, we normally see in our intro psych textbooks that he's the founder of functionalism, but he did have some indirect impact on it, but it was more directly influenced by the work of John Dewey, who's usually seen, in the way we look at it anyway, as being the founder of functionalism. Now, Edward Thorndike was a functionalist, and one of the reasons that we really focused on him that last unit was he was one of the key functionalists that had a great deal of impact on behaviorism, which is going to be the topic for today. So he had a great deal of impact on behaviorism because he offers up this law of effect, which B.F. Skinner would take on and build his operant conditioning around it. In addition to other areas, such as Wertheimer establishing the ideas of Gestalt psychology, we saw some of the other antecedents to it was ACT psychology, an early form of psychology that helped to develop some of the notions and ideas of Gestalt. Now, the rise of behaviorism is one of the things that aided in keeping Gestalt psychology from gaining a lot of footing in the United States. So it sort of prevented it from expanding, because what we'll see here in the lecture that we'll be doing today is that behaviorism became a major movement. So it just wasn't enough. It wasn't enough territory, psychological territory in the United States for there to be room for Gestalt in behaviorism. So it's like those old Westerns where you got to get out of town because there's not room in this town for both of us, like we see in those Westerns. So that's what happened there. So rise of behaviorism sort of helped destroy the Gestalt movement. Now, in pragmatism, again, one of the cornerstones of functionalism, there's this term that we mentioned called fallibilism. And this is the philosophical doctrine that claims to knowledge could in principle be mistaken, meaning that we can't be certain of anything. And there was one item in there that people sort of missed, and I want to clarify it to an extent here, is that for Descartes, remember Descartes, who was the Mac Daddy of doubt, what Descartes was attempting to do was to remove doubt. He wanted certainty. And so the idea here is this fallibilism and this ideas of what Descartes was trying to do, they are sort of what in conflict with one another. And that's what that item was attempting to do. So William James proposed that consciousness is like a stream, and its purpose was to aid in our survival, a very evolutionary idea. And so we see, starting off with William James, and then also continuing to the whole idea of functionalism, that evolution, which we talked about in a previous chapter, has a strong reach, okay, into psychology, into the developing of some of these schools of psychology, very much so. Also, William James is also credited with many things, and one of them is being one of the first individuals to start looking at certain concepts such as self-esteem, a sense of worth and value we have about ourselves. So those were some of the notions too that I wanted to make sure that we covered. Now, a couple of others, and this is the last slide for the items review here. The phi phenomena is an optical illusion of perceiving a series of still images when viewed in rapid succession, and Max Wertheimer defined this phenomena in the early 1900s. This phenomena also was utilized by Hugo Munzberg's theory of film and are part of the process of motion perception. And we see Munzberg as an individual who is a functionalist, who has been associated with the start of IO psychology and even forensic psychology. So functionalism, again, the key idea that we see functionalism, okay, is the notion that it has some practicality to it. It's very pragmatic. Now, a couple of other ideas. Our mind wants to make the most meaningful yet easiest interpretation of stimuli that it can generate, and that is the minimum principle of perception, or prognon. So we see that as one of the key foundations of Gestalt. That's one of the reasons that we see certain types of illusions or two figures in one, because our mind is wanting to make an easy interpretation that we best that we can, but is the most meaningful. Now, per Tishner, he also had this idea of the context theory of meaning, which gives meaning to those sensations that we talked about a little bit earlier in a few slides ago. So in Gestalt learning as well, they offer up the idea of transposition, means once an organism learns a principle in some sort of problem-solving situation, they can apply that principle to other situations. I believe in the lecture I communicated this basic idea is, for example, you can give somebody a fish, or you can teach them how to fish. You teach them the principle of fishing, and then you can use that for other types of things. And that's the basic idea there. And then finally, we go back to William James again with his ideas of consciousness, or the stream of consciousness. He basically says this stream of consciousness, again, he saw consciousness as being very important for our survival. That's why we have it. Parts of the stream of consciousness are very fleeting and serve only to join together more stable parts of consciousness. So the fleeting parts of the stream of consciousness, the thing that can sort of fly away and flitter away, are the transitive parts, but the ones who have a more stability to them are called substantive parts of our stream of consciousness. So those are, again, the key items I want to make sure that we covered before we had so much more time out of exam 4. Okay, so what we talk about now is behaviorism, and that was the topic of this week. So first, what we did is we started off with the notion of the Russian objective psychology. So it sort of starts with them to an extent. We start off with an individual called Ivan Sechenov, and with Ivan Sechenov, he wanted to explain all psychic phenomena on the basis of associationism and materialism. And materialism, again, we talked about initially, I think, some time ago in the philosophy of the mind, the doctrine that nothing exists except matter and its movements and modifications. So he is really taking it back to the physiological roots here. All right. So both internal behavior, and that would be mental processes, and external behavior are reflexive. And that from Sekhanov's perspective, they were triggered by some sort of external stimulation. So everything starts with something out in the environment, something out in the world, some sort of external stimulation. So the main purpose, in his perspective, of the central nervous system was to inhibit reflexive behavior. So we are nothing but reflexive creatures in a sense, and our central nervous system is designed to try to inhibit this automatic reflexive type of behavior. So human development, from his perspective, was the slow establishment of inhibitory control over this reflexive behavior. He rejected the idea of any type of spontaneous or unelicited behavior. So everything starts out in the world with some sort of stimulus out in the world, and we can control ourselves as we develop and mature with inhibitory control. So from this perspective, Sekhenov was basically communicating the idea that the only valid approach to the study of psychology involved objective methods of physiology. All right, so he brought everything back to the physical, to the material. Okay, so in addition, we see now with Sekhenov, we then see the individual that we're most familiar with, and that's going to be Ivan Pavlov. Okay, Ivan Pavlov did his work quite a bit on the digestive system, and he discovered it somewhat through serendipity. As he was doing work on the digestive system of dogs, he discovered a key aspect of learning. So doing his work on the physiology of the digestive system, he discovered what we call the conditioned reflex. Now, it should be noted that he saw objects or events associated with the presentation of food also produced gastric secretions, and that is a fancy word of saying saliva. They salivated. Okay, so we saw now that he was able to look and discover that things associated with food now brings out the salivation or the gastric secretions. All right, so he referred to these as conditional because they depended on something else. So these were conditional reflexes. Okay, conditional reflex meaning that this person was associated with food, and when they saw this person, they began to salivate. A conditional reflex. Now, it's noted here an early translation or mistranslation of his work made conditional conditioned, and that's why we have it today of conditional reflexes as opposed to conditional. Now, just a little bit of background here. He did want to be a priest when he first started out, Pavlov did, but he read work of Sekhenov, and that inspired him to focus more on this type of work, which led him to where we are today. He won the Nobel Prize, I think it was 1904, I think, for his work in digestion. So obviously what we see here is an important event in psychology because he sets the stage to some extent for the movement that would become a major movement in the United States of behaviorism. So again, most of you are probably very familiar with this, but just bear with me. I want to go over real quickly this Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning quickly here. All right, so in Pavlov, we see he was able to illustrate to the world, into psychology, a very hardcore, objective way of demonstrating psychology. All right, so he had this unconditioned response, an innate unconditioned reflex is triggered by an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus which naturally elicits the unconditioned response out of the organism. So food elicits salivation out of an organism. So if food is presented to you, you begin to salivate, if you find the food pleasing at least. So the conditioned reflex or conditioned response is developed by the laws of contiguity and frequency, meaning that these things, these stimuli must be associated together in some way. And if you do it a lot, then you'll have stronger conditioning. If you do it very little, you'll have some conditioning, but it may be very weak. So conditioned reflex is developed by the laws of contiguity, association, and frequency, how often you do it. So we start off with a biologically neutral stimulus, a stimulus that does not elicit a specific response, okay? And then it becomes associated through contiguity with the unconditioned stimulus and develops the capacity to elicit some fraction of the unconditioned response. So what we see here is by pairing together a neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, then that neutral stimulus takes on some of the capacity to elicit a response in the organism. So at this point, that neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the response to the conditioned stimulus is the conditioned response. So in the research that Pavlov was doing, he used a variety of things. He used a variety of tools like a metronome, a buzzer, or whistle, a light, as these neutral stimuli to make them become conditioned stimuli that would then elicit some response in the organism. So Pavlov conditioning, we see a dog salivating at the sight of a person bringing food is the example of classical conditioning, and the salivation is the conditioned response. Through conditioning, the stimuli which controls an organism's behavior, we increase from a few unconditioned stimuli to countless other stimuli which have become associated. So you have this unconditioned stimuli that becomes associated with a variety of other types of stimuli. They become associated through this contiguity by being associated. And then what we see is all the central nervous system activity can be characterized as either excitation or inhibition. The pattern, according to Pavlov, of this excitation or inhibition that characterizes the brain at any given moment, he refers to as a cortical mosaic. So what we're seeing here is a collection of all these types of conditionings, of these conditioning stimuli associated with this unconditioned stimuli becomes this cortical mosaic. Sort of the idea of how he's relating this conditioning to things going on in the brain. So now what we have is another aspect that you have to cover when you talk about Pavlovian conditioning. How do you extinguish the conditioning? So we pair together neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus enough times that we have acquisition. They've acquired the neutral stimulus, then becomes the conditioned stimulus. But how do you break it? So in order to break that conditioning is called extinction. So what you do, if a conditioned stimulus is no longer followed by the unconditioned stimulus, then extinction of the response will occur. So what you do is you just keep presenting that thing which at one point was neutral, which is now conditioned stimulus. You keep presenting it without reintroducing the unconditioned stimulus. So you're doing basically the opposite of what you did in the acquisition phase. In the acquisition phase, you pair the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus together enough times that you establish the bond. Here, you're presenting the conditioned stimulus without that unconditioned stimulus breaking that bond. And then what you will see eventually is the conditioned stimulus will no longer bring about a response. When that occurs, we have extinction. Now, after extinction has occurred and you wait for a while, time elapses, then if you reintroduce that conditioned stimulus again, you may see the following. The conditioned response may reoccur. When this does occur, it's referred to as spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery. After the extinction and time has elapsed, the producing the conditioned stimulus again will cause a conditioned response, spontaneous recovery. It's almost as if in this instance, the organism has forgotten that that condition has been extinguished. Now, another aspect that I want to bring up is called experimental neurosis. It occurs when excitatory and inhibitory tendencies are brought into conflict. Experimental neurosis is essentially a psychosis that is produced artificially. The stress of not being able to solve the experimental problem causes the behavior to appear. One example that I was able to find that sort of gives you the idea of what could happen is this. You start off with normal differentiation between two tones, for example. Okay, so you have tone 1 and tone 2, which you're able to differentiate. You make the differentiation more and more refined so that the difference between tone 1 and tone 2 becomes smaller and smaller. When the organisms can no longer tell the difference between tone 1 and tone 2, experimental neurosis results after a time. The idea is that you're having these two things being sort of incompatible with each other, and it's sort of difficult for the organism to deal with the conflict. And that is what they mean by experimental neurosis. Now, the next individual is Vladimir Bekarev. He argued for objective psychology, which is almost exclusively concentrated on the relationship between the environmental stimulation, which we saw again mentioned earlier by Sekhanov, and behavior. He argued for a discipline he referred to as reflexology, by which he meant strictly objective study of human behavior that seeks to understand the relationship between environmental influences on overt behavior. Something very similar to the movement that we'll see a little bit later in the US of US behaviorism. What Pavlov called the conditioned reflex, Bekarev called an association reflex. And apparently these two individuals did not get along well, or he was very critical of Pavlov, Bekarev was. So what we're seeing here is the establishment of some of the core ideas by the Russian objective psychologist here of behaviorism, which will be a good foundation that we will see a little bit later when others take up the charge of behaviorism. And that starts with this individual, John Watson. So John Watson, really one of the hardcore individuals for behaviorism. Early in his career, he announced his behavioristic views. He was criticized, so he went quiet for a while, but then he came back big with a lecture where he focused psychology as the behaviorist views it. And this was a behaviorist manifesto. And I always get cautious when I hear manifesto. So with Behavior Manifesto, which he lays out the basic tenets of behaviorism as he saw it. And so he's almost unapologetically here, very hardcore behaviorist. So they were the following. Psychology is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Now remember, we've seen this happen a time or two already, where we've been striving for a very long time comparing ourselves to the natural sciences. And so what he's doing here, he's saying we are a branch of natural science, purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. And this is a big one here. And introspection forms no essential part of its method. So he's really kicking introspection here to the curb. All right. The behaviorist and his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response recognizes, and this is another big one, that there's no dividing line between man and brute. So he's saying here, very unapologetically, that there is no real dividing line between man and animal when it comes to behavior. So it's okay for us to study animals, and we can learn a lot from them. So what we see with John Watson here is we see an individual who is very much a true believer in the purity of behaviorism. So he's not talking about anything by any way that smacks of mental processes or cognition. Everything for him is all about the behavior. And that's what we see with his ideas, all about the behavior, things which are very, very objective. So for Watson's objective psychology, the goal was the prediction and control of behavior. He saw 4 types of behavior. The 4 types of behavior: explicit overt, implicit covert, explicit unlearned, and implicit learned. So talking, walking, heart rate increasing from learned behavior, from feared stimulus. So he tried to capture everything that we're capable of doing and putting it in some form of behavior. So from his perspective, all behavior, including thinking, falls into one of these categories. So for him, language and thinking are behaviors. So from this, he had 4 methods of research: observational or naturalistic, okay, or conditioned reflex method, which we saw with Pavlov and Bekarev, or testing, meant taking samples of behavior, or verbal reports, which were treated as any type of overt behavior. So obviously, he was not able to successfully, in many people's opinion, get all the types of things that we are capable of doing as human beings and putting it in some version of behavior. But in order for us to really understand ourselves, human beings anyway, he had to do that, because what he was saying, it's all about the behavior. It starts with and ends with behavior, behavior, behavior. So for John Watson, behavior wisdom had 2 long-lasting effects. His work, the work of the Russian objective psychologist before, and what he did, the effects were this: psychology's main goal changed from description and explanation of states of consciousness to the prediction and control of behavior. And for a time, at least, overt behavior was the almost exclusive subject matter of psychology. So we see now the movement of hardcore behaviorism is now taking force here. And later, a few decades later, you'll see some people are going to get tired of it to some extent, and that's going to be individuals like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, as they try to push the humanistic movement out into the forefront. Because for a long time, it was all about behaviorism, behaviorism, behaviorism. So some other influences were out there as well, which will sort of give some light to some of the things that we'll see in the future. One of them would be William McDougall. Psychology is the science of behavior, but this particular behaviorist, in a sense, did not disregard mental events as unimportant. So for him, he did not close the door. He was not as hardcore, I guess you would say, as was John Watson. So for him, we could study mental events objectively by their influence on behavior. So there was some indication there's something going on mentally, and they do influence our behavior. So he saw that by ignoring the purposive nature of behavior is missing some of the most important aspects. So all behavior is stimulated by instinctual energy from his perspective, and humans are born with a number of instincts that provides motivation to act in certain ways. For him, we could not ignore these aspects. And so for him, behaviorism needed to include at least the acknowledgement of these factors when we thought about it. Another individual is Edwin Guthrie, and his law of learning of contiguity. A stimuli which accompanies a movement will, on its reoccurrence, tend to be followed by that movement. Contiguity, again, we've talked about it a couple of times. I want to make sure we understand the basic premise behind it. Contiguity is the sequential occurrence or proximity of stimulus and response causing their association in the mind. So contiguity is basically saying these things become associated with one another. So he comes up with this law of learning of contiguity, saying that this is one of the key ways in which we learn, by how these things are associated. So reinforcement changes the stimulus situation and thus preserves the association that preceded the reinforcement condition. So when the stimulus situation changes, and thus the last response made will not be associated with other situations, but with the one that caused it. So with that situation possible again, that response is more likely to occur again. So we see him again, this idea of reinforcement, very behavioristic concept. So in addition, now we see Skinner come onto the scene. And Skinner, by some's opinion, is probably one of the most influential individuals of the modern psychological era. And some would say he's in the top 10 of all time, B.F. Skinner. So Skinner's positivism was a very similar to what we see from Francis Bacon, which we talked about at the very beginning of this course, as well as Ernst Mach. His perspective was this: scientists were to collect empirical facts and then infer knowledge from those facts, not devise theories and then deduce facts from theory. Science for him is to be descriptive and inductive rather than theoretical and deductive. So we see he's sort of a toss back to the Francis Bacon type of perspective. Now, he also looked at the functional analysis of behavior, an analysis of the relationship between environmental events and behavioral events. And this is a key point here, because he's very much a hardcore guy as well. Internal events, mental events, internal events have no place in such an analysis because they are events also, and thus need to be explained also. So he did not want to be using internal events to explain behavior because they need their own explanation. So he didn't want to get things confused. So internal events cannot serve as explanations or causes of behavior. I'm going to pause there, see if there are any questions or comments so far. I've been on a roll. Okay, I also want to remind you, if you did just show up recently, please send that you are present here so I can make sure I have you on my records of attending this session. Okay, there seems to be no questions or comments at this time. An example of an internal event would be something similar to this. And we'll see a little bit later when we talk about Tolman. But what causes someone to do something? Let's say you see somebody and their face gets all scrunched up and they go over and they perform some sort of action. So from somebody's perspective, from others' perspective, they'll say that something motivated him, something caused him to do something. And from the hardcore behaviorist perspective, they don't want to talk about anything that they could not see, some internal event, some sort of motivating factor. We don't have a clue about what motivated this person. So as far as the hardcore behaviorists would be saying, we shouldn't even consider it or talk about things like motivation or about this or learning. Anything that takes place inside the black box of our mind is something that we don't know about. And so that's what he's sort of re-emphasizing here, is that we cannot use these things, these internal events, to explain causes of behavior because they need their own explanations. Okay, so he wanted to keep things in the world of objectivity, very much like Watson did. So B.F. Skinner saw that there were two types of behavior. Yes, is there a comment? Okay, thought I heard somebody. All right, two types of behavior. We have respondent behavior, which is the area of reflexive behavior, which we saw with Watson and Pavlov and others. Behavior which is related to environmental stimuli. So when we talk about classical or Pavlovian conditioning, the organism, us in this case, or any other organism, is very passive. We don't have to do anything. We just sit there like a lump of coal, and stimuli are presented to us. And if the right stimuli are presented in the right way, we can respond. We have some sort of response, a reflexive type of behavior. So with operant behavior, a different type of behavior per Skinner, operant behavior is behavior that is influenced by its consequences. And because it operates on the environment, in such a way as to produce consequences, he referred to it as operant behavior. So in classical conditioning, the organism is very, very passive. But in operant conditioning of B.F. Skinner's, you have to do something. You must operate on the environment in some way, because that's how the learning starts. When you do something, there is going to be a consequence to you doing something. So Skinner's free operant methodology, which the organism is free to respond in the experimental chamber, his Skinner box, for example. And so they respond, okay, and they're going to get reinforced, and then that will predict the likelihood of future behavior, future responses. So the relevant measure is usually the rate of the selected response. Operant conditioning takes place as the behavior of the organism is affected by its consequences. So that's the key thing. You must do something, and then there are going to be consequences for it. And so as you're able to control the consequences, you're able to control the organism. Now, this points out something that I sort of alluded to earlier. Behaviorism is very much about, as we saw with Watson earlier, about predicting and controlling behavior. They just come out and say it. We want to predict and we want to control behavior. And later, a couple of decades later, we'll see Maslow, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers really don't like that idea because it seems too controlling over human beings. They're the ones who are saying we are self-determination and all that type of stuff. You know, we have our own free will. Because at this time, behaviorism was still going rather strong, and it was all about controlling people. Okay, and they did not like those ideas. So we see here in B.F. Skinner, very similar to Watson, some very hardcore behaviorist ideas. So for B.F. Skinner, reinforcement is the process by which consequences of a behavior increases the rate of probability of that behavior. So you behave a certain way, and then there's going to be a consequence. If whatever that consequence is causes you to do more of that behavior, it has been reinforced. As far as B.F. Skinner was concerned, you don't need to have any more analysis or your thought or your feelings. All that was necessary to know is define the reinforcement. Nothing else is necessary. That is all you need to know. It's all about the behavior. So the reinforcer can be anything as long as its effect is to increase the probability of the behavior that produces the consequence. Again, we can see a lot of pragmatism in that, a lot of functionalism in a way as well. So all these things that we've talked about in the last few chapters have sort of built to this. Now we're talking about behaviorism, which is sort of like the ultimate of pragmatism in a sense. You know, we're looking at things that have some major impact on practicality and functionality here. So influence which behaviors are increased and which are not. Change contingencies and you can change behavior. What are you going to be reinforcing and what are you not going to be reinforcing? Again, this is talking about control of behavior. Okay, so the idea here is that we see a lot more here about controlling of behavior as well as predicting behavior. So if you can control the consequences, you can control the person. A lot of these ideas are very Darwinian or very evolutionary bound as well. So the organism produces a variety of behaviors. Some will result in consequences that will increase the behavior, those that will be functional and reinforcing. So again, think about it this way. Why do we keep doing certain behaviors? We keep doing behaviors, even behaviors that we feel bad about. We keep doing those behaviors because they're reinforcing. Okay? They're reinforcing behaviors. They survive. Those that are not reinforcing, they'll die off. We won't do those behaviors. So these effective behaviors will be selected to be part of the organism's repertoire while others will not. So that's sort of a Darwinian spin on things. So some behaviors survive, some don't. Some are going to be beneficial in some way because we find them reinforcing. Some will not. So they'll sort of die on the vine. Excuse me, the vine. All right. So the journey of psychology continues. All right. There's a couple more things I need to cover, but I want to cover these basic ideas to give you the emphasis of what went on during this era of behaviorism. In the early 1900s, a battle of dominance was occurring. We have structuralism, functionalism, and the psychoanalytic perspective sort of warring it out. An American alternative offered by Watson was an emphasis on pragmatism. Okay, again, we saw this pragmatism, part of it was in functionalism, and we saw it also with William James. They saw that introspection takes us nowhere. Structuralism has no relevance in day-to-day life. So the focus of psychology should change, and that's basically what they did. In America, it changed to prediction and control and exclusively about behavior. So Watson, the focus should be on behavior, the observable. Pavlov's work aided in this by connecting behavior to psychological life. Watson saw the nature-nurture issue as an empirical question. He began to study infant behaviors and their impact on emotion and personality development. And you know the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that he and his assistant, Rosalind Rayner, did the research on little Albert. Okay, and this is what he was doing. He was trying to find out about emotion and development, nature-nurture questions. And again, he said we can do this based solely on behavior. And he wanted to demonstrate that he could do it. And he did. So B.F. Skinner then arrives after Watson arrives on the scene, wanting psychology to be independent of other science. We don't need to know about anything but the behavior itself. We must adopt operational terms and avoid the mentalistic. So he wanted to make sure that everything was operationalized into objective things, things that we can count, things that we can see. All right. He was a fan of Mach's view of science as the level of observation in the experiment. So scientists were to collect empirical facts and then infer knowledge from those facts. And he used Thorndike's work and his law of effect as his foundation to build his work. So B.F. Skinner had big ideas about behaviorism and its impact on society. In education, he offered programmed learning, learning in many areas best accomplished by small incremental steps with immediate reinforcement. So if you ever went to a program on a computer and it took you through certain learning activities and you responded and you got something right or you got something wrong, the next item could be reinforcing. It could branch you to another area to reinforce the proper learning that you require or need. So this is all stemming from the ideas and work of B.F. Skinner. He also had a great deal of impact in therapy when he offered the ideas of behavioral modification. And child rearing, as we know, most of operant conditioning is that. It's a form of child rearing and parenting. And then, of course, ethics. From his perspective, ethics is a result of our reinforcement history. Societal problems are actually problems of reinforcement. We're not reinforcing the right things in the right ways. So the journey of psychology continues, and I just want to spend some time emphasizing the idea that behaviorism does have a major impact on us to a very extraordinary degree. Now, finally, and I will re-upload these slides. There's a couple of changes that I made that I want to make sure that you have. So the final couple of slides I want to look at is Edward Chase Tolman. Okay, he offers up a new view. So what we've been seeing so far is the behaviorist, all right? And so behavior from Tolman's perspective cannot be understood by focusing on events in the moment. And what that view is used to be referred to as molecular. That's the view of Watson, okay? But the molar perspective that he is offering here is basically saying that behavior cannot be understood by focusing on the events of the moment. We have to look beyond that, all right? And so he's looking for something else. And so what Tolman is going to do here, he's going to open up the window a little bit so that we can start thinking about mental processes again. So he studied purposive behavior in contrast to the molecular behavior that we saw with Watson. He used rats again. And why do people use rats in this stage here? Because again, he wanted to avoid introspection. Rats can't introspect, all right? So he offers up this idea of intervening variables. And this is the key point. And this is what will lead us to the next chapter. The intervening variables, variables that intervene between an environmental event, something that happens in the world around us, and then our behavior, okay? So he's saying there's something that is important that happens between the stimuli in the world and then our behavior. So stimuli in the world, some intervening variable, and then our behavior. So Tolman's intervening variables were cognitive processes, which are influential in determining behavior. So he opened up the idea that we can't ignore these things, that these things are very important for us to really truly understand what's going on. He believed that learning occurs constantly with or without reinforcement, or with or without motivation. So we've seen previously when people have talked about learning and reinforcement, we saw these things being very key to our learning. But he says, no, it doesn't need to happen. We do this automatically. So from his perspective, learning takes place constantly as the organism simply interacts with the environment. And one of the things, which I'm sure you recall, is latent learning. And this is the idea that you can sometimes learn things and not even know that you've learned it. You learned it latently, okay? And so performance is the translation of learning into behavior. With latent learning, it showed that learning remained latent until an organism had a reason to use it, which was an incentive. So the idea is that you can learn things without a motivation, without reinforcement. You learn something, but you don't demonstrate the learning until there is an incentive to do so. So this is his idea of this notion of latent learning, okay, that's going on. So Tolman's behaviorism opens the door for further examination of mental processes. That was the key idea that we saw here with Tolman that will tie us from the behaviorism to the next chapter that we'll be looking at next week, cognitive psychology. Because now, once we start tying this together, we can start looking at things of mental processes again. Because up until this point, over the last couple of sections here, we've been in the world of pragmatism, practicality, and really hasn't focused a great deal on things that were too cognitive in their nature. So a couple of things again, the notion is we finish up our behaviorism. We have only 2 more chapters to look at as we wrap up this course. It's going to be cognitive psychology, chapter 17, and then finally chapter 18, looking at modularity, neuroscience, and embodied cognition. I see that some of you already started some of the items from this last module with discussion questions and all that type of stuff. Please keep that up. A couple of things I want to remind us of and announce here real quickly is essays 5 and 6 are no longer required. I'll be sending out a message a little bit later about if you want to have an opportunity to redo an essay or something of that nature a little bit later. There are going to be a couple other bonus activities. I see that one is already posted and you guys have already done that as a discussion forum. That's a bonus activity. But I also want to inform you of something called the senior assessment and give you a little bit of background about it. A senior assessment is an activity that I want you guys to do. I didn't have it available at the beginning of the semester, so I wasn't part of the course structure, but I will use it as an activity to give you guys some extra credit and to use it to replace another activity that you may have missed or not performed as well in. The senior assessment is an assessment. It's 50 items or so. And what it does, it looks at your knowledge of psychology, okay? And it just basically assesses what you know about psychology. If you take it, it will not hurt you. It will only help you, and I will encourage you to take it. So I'll send you a little bit more information about that a little bit later as we wrap up things today and tomorrow. All right. That's it for me for now. So I'll ask if there are any questions or comments at this time. Okay, silence again and no chat messages. Okay, all right, since there are no questions or comments or no chats at this time, that's all I have for you today. So that's it. Please look for a recording of this session a little bit later on your Canvas site. If there's nothing else, you guys are free to get out of here. Have a good weekend and please stay safe. I'll see you guys later. If you're not graduating this semester, do you need to take the ETS? I'll have to check. I'm not quite sure. I think that might have been communicated earlier. That might be the case, but I'll check to make sure. All right, bye, y'all. Yes, the senior assessment is different than the ETS. The senior assessment that you guys will be doing, that I'll post for you guys, we use that as a metric to see how well we are doing at communicating some basic psychological ideas to you. You may recall, if you went to general psychology here, you most likely took a test at the end of the semester of your general psychology course called, I forget what it's called, but it's a mandatory assessment for general psychology students. And so they test your knowledge at that time about how well you got the general psychology ideas. And then we also test you later when you're in a senior class like this one to see what you have learned as well. So that's what the senior assessment is, sort of an assessment of us to make sure that basic ideas have been communicated to you and how well you know them. All right. Yeah, there are several things. One of them is the CLA, several ways in which we are being assessed, and the CLA is one of them. We've been changing them, so I'm not quite sure. I think the ETS may have taken place of the CLA. I'll have to check on that, but I've sent a couple of messages out already, so please check your email, but I'll check as well. Okay, guys, I'll see ya.